So my name is Suzanne, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm a former IB student, and I went to Toronto French School. And I've been devoting my life to learning about activism and social change, and that really started in high school. And I want to thank Eric and Tanai for inviting me to come back to the school and also be a part of this presentation and share really what I've learned and how I learned it. And I'm really excited to be here. And I think it's a really important presentation and workshop because I think learning about social justice is really not obvious. And I would say that in all of my years of learning, and I did a master's degree in politics and economics of development at the University of Toronto, and I studied in different universities across the globe, worked at the United Nations. In all of my formal learning about poverty, development, and social justice, I actually had a hard time and didn't really come to some of the important and critical conclusions that I've learned through other ways. And so I'm really here because I think learning about social justice is so critical and it's really not obvious. And a lot of the formal mechanisms that we have for learning can lead us astray, and they did lead me astray. So I'm committed to sharing how I've learned and what I've learned with you. Um, so thanks for having me, and I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. Um, just going to try and change slides here. So I know that you started off the day today talking about why you're here, and I've already begun to share a little bit about why I'm here, but I really wanted to flesh that out a little bit more. So why am I here? Why did I take the time to record this and share with you? Well, inequity is getting worse. Social issues are, on a lot of indicators, getting worse. And it's not due, from my learning and understanding, it's really not due to a lack of engagement. We have over 2 million NGOs, and actually the numbers of people engaging in charity or social justice or some kind of social work is increasing, but still on a lot of indicators, a lot of social issues are actually getting worse. So really we have a problem not so much with not enough people being engaged, but we have a problem with how effective we are. And William Easterly talks about that as the second tragedy. William Easterly is a really great thinker in terms of international development and social change. And he talks about the first tragedy being the one that we know about, the massive amounts of poverty and injustice that exist in the world. But he really focuses on the second tragedy, and I think it's an important one for us to understand as well. The second tragedy is actually that we've thrown trillions of dollars into solving these social issues, and they're not very effective at all. And this has been going on for decades. And that is the second and somehow more problematic tragedy that we have, that we're throwing a lot of money and time into these social change efforts and they're actually not working. So what we need isn't necessarily more and just throwing more people and potentially more students into engaging in social issues, but we really need a sophisticated analysis of what the root issues are and the solutions. And that kind of analysis, that kind of social justice learning and analysis is truly very scarce and hard to come by. And that's why I'm so excited to be here, because this is a room full of people that are interested in teaching social justice education with quality and with sophistication. And I think that is really the turning point in how we can begin to become more effective. If we understand the root issues, then we can solve them. So supporting people to do that kind of analysis is so important. This presentation, the overview, I'm going to share how I learned, what I learned, and then just a last element on what next, where we can go, where in this room we can go next. So how I learned what I learned. As I briefly mentioned earlier, I studied this exact topic, international development, poverty, social development, I did 2 master's degrees at one, and I studied, like I was saying, at the University of Toronto, the University of British Columbia, the University of North Carolina, University of Cape Town. I also worked at the United Nations. I worked for the Ministry of Food and Agriculture in Ghana. And through none of those formal mechanisms for learning or even work, did I really uncover some of the pieces which guide me today around why is there poverty and what we can do about it. So it's actually outside of those dominant structures that I really learned insightful things. Why is that? Because of something I get called the dominant narrative. So in all of these institutions and that I've worked and studied in, the dominant narrative is somehow perpetuated. This narrative, a dominant narrative being the analysis perpetuated by those in power, which defines our reality and shapes our understanding of social dynamics. So these institutions, the books that we read and the people that we listen to are from situations of power, and it's really hard to understand the social issues when you're in a position of power and not experiencing them. Robert Chambers, who's another great thinker on the topic, writes, he has a poem that I'll share with you. All powerful uppers think they know what's right and real for those below. At least all uppers so believe, but all are wrong, all power deceives. And truly, power I did find deceptive, and in positions of power and also surrounding myself in institutions of learning and work that were really with those that were on the side of that had a bit more power meant that we were further away from reality and had a difficult time then understanding what was going on. Robert Chambers writes a good book, Whose Reality Counts, and I would recommend it. So how did I learn if it wasn't in these formal places of learning and formal jobs? It was through relationships outside of normative roles. So it was through striking up friendships with people that were on the street, or through becoming engaged with people in a way where I was outside of my normal role. So I wasn't a volunteer, I wasn't a worker, I wasn't even a student, I was just a human being, and they as well were not in their normative role. When someone is, if you're a social worker and someone's a client, it's difficult to actually learn from each other in real ways because you sort of play out your normative role. So it was through relationships outside of normative roles that really helped me to learn and listen to people who were experiencing injustice. So how I learned was through building those injustice, trusting them, listening to them, and then just self-reflecting. Because a lot of the learning required me to look at myself and see the ways that I had been in some ways perpetuating injustices as well. Moving on to not how I learned what I learned, but also what I learned. A big piece that I learned from listening to people experiencing the injustices firsthand, is that often we tend to blame people on the receiving end of injustice for the problem at hand. So we tend to blame people who are poor. There's a term called the bad, the mad, the sad. And those are the people that we are either trying to help or trying to, that are excluded from our society. And when we think about when we think about where does the problem lie, oftentimes we decide that the problem lies with people that are bad, so criminals, people that are mad, people that are not behaving in normative ways, people that are behaving in ways that are outside the social norm, and people that are sad. So this would be sort of people that are in situations of poverty. So we just tend to look at those people in situations on the receiving end of injustice. So for example, people that are poor as the problem. They are not educated, or they are lazy, or they are XYZ. instead of actually recognizing that the systems are the problem and listening to those folks themselves, listening to those individuals that are living the injustice and learning from them about where the problem actually lies. So this is an image I thought just to bring some of these pieces to light. Black Lives Matter is a really great movement that's happening right now, and it's topical. And this kind of brings to light some of the pieces that I'm talking about, where it's so important to listen to people on the receiving end of Black racism, so that we can understand exactly how Black racism works. And certainly it's easy to look at the number of Black people in prison and say, well, they must be the problem, or there's a problem in that community. But it's so important instead not to blame those on the receiving end of injustice, the bad, the mad, the sad, but actually look at the structures and institutions, and instead listen to people from the Black community to understand how racism is working. So what have I learned? Like I said, the problem's not out there in what's termed the bad, the mad, the sad. It's not out there. There aren't problems out there that we need to solve. The problems are actually in the systems that we all live in, and these are systems of exclusion and oppression. And the gaze we so often place on these others, we need to instead focus the gaze on privilege, on these dominant structures, on these privileged structures, on the privileged culture, and on privileged individual behaviors. The problem's not out there. That's just the effect that our systems are having. So focusing the gaze as someone who benefits from quite a bit of privilege, focusing the gaze on myself, on my community, on where I'm from. And that's really where a lot of the problems tend to lie. Racism is a good example. I'm white, so looking at how racism is perpetuated in my communities. Sophisticated analysis of problems and solutions must come from listening and learning from those with lived experience of oppression. And I think that's my most take-home message, that the best way to understand, and actually the only way I've ever come to understand what the root causes of the social issues are, is to listen to people who are on the receiving end of injustice. So listen to people living in poverty who can tell me exactly how that plays out and what the root of the problems are. And that so rarely happens. So I guess this is a bit of a slide to recap. Privilege, I think really understanding what privilege means. Privilege, these are unearned, unasked for, and often invisible benefits and advantages that are readily available to dominant identity groups. So an example would be being white, or being part of a middle upper class, or being heterosexual, and society awards you benefits, and it's easier to swim in this world when you are part of those identities as opposed to non-dominant groups. And there's just a note here, I cannot be blind to the invisible system of privilege that I am a part of. It's often easy, and in fact part of being part of a dominant group is that you're blind to the benefits you're receiving. It's hard for me to see racism because I'm not on the receiving end of it. So if you do find yourself a member of a privileged group, and we're never fully privileged or fully oppressed, there's aspects of ourselves that are a bit of everything, but what can you do with privilege? You can be an ally. An ally is a word that's used very, it's thrown around very easily, but it means something quite specific. An ally is a member of a dominant group who works to dismantle any form of oppression from which they receive benefits. So it's something quite specific. It's a white person working to dismantle Black racism. It's a heterosexual person working to dismantle homophobia. And you use your privilege to help support the groups with lived experience that are leading the change. So the gay rights movement is an excellent example. The gay rights movement was led by people that themselves are gay with their allies, their heterosexual allies, who stood beside them in marches and made it more difficult for then the police and others to stop those marches, because heterosexual people with some power and privilege were also there standing beside them. So how to be an ally? These are examples of ways, these are images of examples of ways My Canada listens to its First Nations. So listening, I benefit from colonialism, I don't. So just recognizing the ways that your privilege allows you to benefit, and then standing beside people who don't, and listening to them and understanding how you can support their movements, and getting involved with and listening to those, like I said, with the lived experience, who can, and understanding how they want you to support the movements that they're leading. A last piece to share of what I've learned, and I think it's an important distinction, is there's a distinction between charity and justice. So charity is aid that's given to those in need. It addresses an immediate need. It's giving food to somebody who is hungry. Justice is quite different. Justice is fairness, equity, the fair distribution of advantages, assets, and benefits among all members of a society. So it's addressing the root cause of a problem. So in the food example, it would be looking at why someone is unable to access food in the first place. It's important that we do charity and justice work. So I just want to be clear that this isn't, my learnings haven't led me to believe that we shouldn't be doing charity work. We shouldn't be handing out foods or handing out pieces to address immediate needs, because the immediate needs are real and they're urgent. People need food in order to survive. And so when people are going hungry, having things like food banks is absolutely critical. It's just also important to ask, what is the root cause of this problem? And in asking what is the root cause of this problem, and also in asking what are the immediate needs that need to be addressed, it's so essential that we follow the guidance of those that, for example, are unable to access food. So if we're designing a program to feed people, or if we're trying to understand what the root cause of food insecurity is, listening to people who don't have access to food, and having them guide the process, because they know the situation best, and we can listen, be an ally, and use our privilege to take things forward. So the now what, this is the final piece of the presentation. The now what is basically places to start. And I think a good place to start, potentially in school, but certainly if I think about where some of my most fruitful learning started, it's understanding what is my role in social change and how is that connected to my identity. So, and a really important first question when we're thinking about engaging in social justice is, do I identify with communities that experience injustice? So am I on the receiving end of injustice? And if I am, and I have shared experiences of injustice with a community, then I have a very specific role to play, and it might be about speaking out and sharing what that injustice looks like, feels like, how it works. So if you are part of the LGBTQ community and you identify with that community, it can be about, your role might be about, if that's an issue that is of interest, it might be about sharing what it's like to be on the receiving end of homophobia. Whereas if you don't identify with a community that's experiencing injustice, the question is then how to be an ally. And once again, an ally is very specific. It's using your privilege to support the work of the community that's experiencing injustice. And the first step in being an ally is listening to those with lived experience. And then asking, what can I do that will be supportive of your movement? This is just a small tool that you can find online that can help yourself or students understand parts of their identity and whether they identify with the dominant or the less dominant, so the privileged or the oppressed identity. And it can be a way of beginning to unpack parts of your identity and then what your role in social change might be. And yeah, this last slide is just some examples of how I myself have tried to ally with different communities and different individuals. So I have worked very closely with somebody in prison whose name is Pete Collins, to try and work to end prisoner injustice. And we've written letters. The picture on the right is just a picture of a letter, and that's how he recently passed away, but that's how we used to communicate, is through letter writing, and we would do shared presentations, and he would write me his portion of the presentation. And he's also a cartoonist, and we've made films together as well. That's just a cartoon that he made from inside. And I think that Eric and Tanai might share with you a video that we made together a little later. But that's an example of just supporting somebody else's voice who has the lived experience, who's in prison, to talk about what prison injustice looks like, and to basically provide a platform for his voice to get out. And when I was working with Toronto French School, some of the students also wrote letters with people inside prison to learn about the prison system. So that kind of learning directly from people experiencing the injustice can be quite fruitful. So what will you do next? I know that's where the conversation that Eric and Tanai are leading I know that's where the conversation will go. And I just wanted to provide my contact information. I'm happy to provide resources, support in any way that I can, and I wish you luck.